Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second of 8 policy brown bags hosted by the Educational Leadership Policy faculty in the College of Ed at Texas Tech University. I am so excited to introduce our guest speaker today, who I hope doesn't mind that I made a little bit of a bio about. So Carrie Conaway, we're very lucky to have, and that she's offered her generous time to share with us today. Carrie Conaway is a senior lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Up until 2019, she was the Chief Strategy and Research Officer for the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and led the agency's Office of Planning and Research, which strengthens planning, data, and resource use, and the focus on evidence in the agency and the field to improve outcomes for the state of Massachusetts students. Previously, she was the Deputy Director of the New England Public Policy Center at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and an Associate Editor of the bank's flagship publication, Regional Review. Now, in addition to serving in these teaching and leadership capacities, Carrie is also a prolific scholar and mentor in education policy circles, which is how I got to know her. She served as the president of the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy in 2018-19 and served on the executive board for several years. She has authored a number of journal articles in high-impact education policy journals, policy reports, book chapters, as well as more public-facing and accessible blogs and op-eds. She recently co-authored the book Common Sense Evidence, The Education Leader's Guide to Using Data and Research, published by Harvard Education Press. So, with 20 years of experience in integrating research and practice to improve public policy, it is my pleasure to turn it over to my friend and mentor, Carrie Conaway, for today's talk, 5 Ways Research Partnerships Can Fail. It's all yours, Carrie.
Thank you so much, Jacob, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for spending a little time with me today. My plan is that I think I'm going to talk for about half the time, and there should be a good half hour or so at the end for questions. I'm happy to take questions on this content or whatever else, so I look forward to engaging with you then. But what I wanted to talk about was research partnerships that fail. And this is because my old job, when I was the research director for the State Department of Ed in Massachusetts for over a decade, and I did a lot of partnering with researchers. It could be really useful for informing policy and practice. It is also exasperating and very hard. And I was talking about this with my colleague, Nate Schwartz, who had a similar job to mine in Tennessee. And he and I noticed that we were seeing similar patterns in when projects were falling apart. So we actually wrote a short brief, and let me stick in the chat in case anybody wants to super nerd out and go read this later. We wrote with a third person, Laura Booker, a short article on ways in which research partnerships fail. And I'm going to sort of summarize the basic ideas here, but then there's more detail and more examples and strategies and stuff there. So my hope is that by sharing my mea culpas and my mistakes, that maybe other people will learn and not have to learn everything the hard way, the way that I did. And so hopefully that'll be useful. We talk about 5 different ways that things can fail. My thought is I'm going to just tell you each of them, an example of a way in which I've seen this go apart, and then hopefully some strategies for helping to address them. And this will be, I think, a mostly, if not entirely, PowerPoint-free experience, because as I told Jacob, I made PowerPoints, and I was like, these add no value. So you're getting me and slides, and no slides today. So, so the first thing is expecting program staff to set the agenda. So what I mean by this is, like, the worst possible research project is the one where the researcher just picks the research question and doesn't ever talk to a practitioner to see if it would be useful or meaningful or helpful in some way. The second worst is the person who has realized that that's a problem and does the opposite thing, the sort of overeager researcher who is, wants to please. And so I would have these meetings where researchers would say, well, what do you want to know about your program? Now, the thing is, when you ask that, the first thing a practitioner is going to say is, I want to know if the program I'm running works or not. And they have almost invariably not set it up in a way that you can actually answer that question, because at least not answer it well and rigorously, because you would need generally some sort of random assignment to who got the treatment and who didn't, or something along those lines to help you differentiate and not just look pre-post, but they don't know that because they're not researchers. And so they think that's a straightforward question to answer, or they will come up with a topic that the researcher doesn't have expertise in, because people's knowledge is so narrow. Often they know quite well one thing, but not broad. And so what they've in effect done is said, here, we will answer whatever you want. Oh, except not that thing. And so it creates this very weird, uncomfortable situation where you feel like they're trying to be helpful, but then they're actually not helpful at all. And the other thing is that the questions that the practitioners will come up with are often not the right ones for researchers to answer. Because what we need from the researcher actually is a new perspective or a new framework, a new way of thinking about things, or digging into something that maybe wouldn't be the most obvious to somebody who's like worked in the field forever, but because they have fresh eyes, they see something differently. And it often requires more iterative learning over time with one another to get to the really interesting, good questions that are really helpful. So the way I learned over the years to get better at this is to ask practitioners to look forward rather than backwards. So rather than to say, is this thing I'm already doing working well? Think about like, what are your priorities? What problems are you trying to solve? What decisions are on the horizon where maybe some new information or a new framework would be useful? And build some time to build a relationship and get deeper in the work. And then you can get to the questions about, impact or evaluation, that kind of thing. But starting there, in my experience, is almost always the wrong place to start. So that's the first one, expecting staff to set the agenda. The second one, excluding critical partners from the table. So I used to think I was doing my colleagues a favor. I would have like an external researcher would call me up and say, hey, I've got this idea for a project. I want to study your school choice programs in Massachusetts, and I want to know about the impact of those programs. Great. So I would be like, I'll just handle this. I don't want to bother the program staff with all this nerdy stuff. So I'm just going to, give them the data, agree on the design, whatever. And basically what I had done was written a recipe for the work not to matter, because I never knew as much about the program staff as the program staff did. They always would know a level of detail and have a level of question that I just never would have thought of. I can think of times when they would say things like, oh, well, probably you shouldn't include those 4 schools in the analysis because they were exempted into this program in a sort of an unusual way and they really are different. Or they would have just a nuanced question about the way things worked that I would have had no way to know was of interest of them. And it really would just put us off at a bad point where like you're at the end of the project from the researcher's perspective, and the program staff are raising really good questions that should have been addressed earlier in the process. So what I learned to do for this was when an external researcher would come, or if we were spinning up a project, like the first thing we did was you must meet the other human, right? Like whoever, go meet the program staff that are running this program. And for the program staff, meet the researchers. Let's start to build a relationship and understand what questions are of interest, what the highest priorities are, if there's timelines that matter. I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the thing I didn't do that I wish I had done even more of was to build those relationships really deep. I heard someone say at a conference, and I wish I'd heard this sooner, to build relationships 4 people deep. So there's not just one person who knows that this researcher is doing this project. There's at least 4 in the program team who are invested. They know the person's doing the work. They know when to expect things. They had a chance to influence the design. So there's like champions for the project, and frequent interaction and things like that, which we will also come back to, because people churn, and especially on the program side, people leave their jobs quite frequently, and the project will fall apart if you only have one person involved. In fact, I now think you might need 4 program people and 4 research and data people to be invested in your project to make sure it's sustained over time. I wish I had done that differently. Another thing I did related to this sort of like making sure people understand the context thing is I actually one time sat with one of my researchers to go through the organizational chart about the part of the organization he was working with, where like, okay, this person's the senior person and they make this type of decision. There are these 2 people whose jobs look similar, but really, And one of them is technically in charge of the thing you're researching, but the other one has a lot more influence with the senior boss. So you actually need this person on board, not just the technically in charge person. Like that level of detail about understanding the context. And I remember the person at the end saying, like, I had no idea why you kept CCing Megan on these emails. And now I understand why you're doing that. And I know who I need to be influencing and working with. So it's like just little things like that can make a big difference. My third challenge that I ran into is overlooking the power of descriptive statistics. This one, I'm going to tell Jacob's favorite story, but the most powerful statistic I ever produced at the agency, which was the number 37%. That is the percent of Massachusetts public high school students who go on to a public college in Massachusetts and then take a remedial course in their first semester. So these are like our bread and butter kids in Massachusetts. They're going to our high schools, they're going to our colleges. 37% of them are taking at least one course that is covering content they should have learned in high school. And that's mostly at the community college level, but there were definitely students, even at our 4-year like flagship university, in that situation. And this statistic, first of all, should not have surprised us, because most of the kids at the Massachusetts public colleges, it turns out, went to Massachusetts public high schools. So if you know the remediation rate overall, you've got a pretty good idea what the remediation rate is for the high school kids. But we had never literally linked the data. So we couldn't say like, these are your kids that are experiencing this challenge when they get to college. And putting those two things together, and that one number changed state policy. It changed for the 4-year colleges. Well, I should add that we've dug in a little more and realized that one big reason that this happened was that a lot of high schools only required 3 years of math. So the kids would stop taking math in 11th grade, they'd miss a year of math, then go to college and have to take a placement test, and they haven't had math in 16 months or something like that. And so it's not that they don't know math, they just forgot some of the technical stuff that they used to know. And it meant that they were taking remedial courses, but maybe didn't actually need the remediation had they kept up their math, right? So the public colleges started requiring 4 years of math to get into so 4 years of math to get into a 4-year college, not for the community colleges, but for the 4-year colleges, you now have to take 4 years of math. And many more of our high schools now require 4 years of math as a high school graduation requirement. And both of those things, I mean, obviously it wasn't only that factor, but having that single number that was so compelling really helped drive a conversation in a way that few other things could have. So when I think about like what the general way to apply that realization, one is that sentence with a number in it, that 37%, and me being able to describe in one sentence that key finding, it really it makes it tangible in a way that few other things do. And it was a sentence that we co-created in this case, we were working with the Department of Higher Education. We were partnering with them. So we worked with them to agree on what's our one sentence that describes this thing that we feel like people really need to know. And then we coupled it with some individual reports for high schools. So high schools in our state not only found out this overall number, they also found out for their kids from their school, what was the percent that went on to take remedial courses? How did it look different by the different colleges that they went to and by the different subgroups they came from and those kinds of comparisons? And so you would see virtually every school in the state had some kids taking remedial courses. Even the schools that didn't think they had kids taking remedial courses were taking remedial courses. So it just makes it personal, and the ability to compare yourself, it's captivating to people who work in practice. They want to know, like, how am I doing relative to other people, and how are my kids doing once they get to college? And it's answering a question that is of great importance to them. And the fact that it's their kids, again, creates this urgency around action that when it's just a general finding, like, again, this is not a surprise. The kids are taking remedial courses. What was a surprise was it's your kids, right? And another strategy that we didn't use on this project, but we did for others, is having an anecdote that tells a story. So in the case of this 37%, telling a story about a particular kid who experienced that, as long as the anecdote is like consistent with the general facts and it's not just like N of one and it may or may not be generally true, that human connection, that storytelling piece, the sort of cause and effect version also can really draw people in. into research work and make it more meaningful and powerful. So, all right. Fourth thing, wrong deliverables at the wrong time. This one, I love to tell what I call the tale of two studies. Two different projects that I worked on with Apt Associates, which is a research vendor that you can hire them to do evaluation work. When I arrived at the agency, they were already on board doing a evaluation of a program we run called Expanded Learning Time. That was any given year, roughly 20 schools would get a grant to be able to expand their learning day it ended up being about 300 hours over the course of the year, so pretty substantial increase. And the time was meant to go for extra time for students on academics, extra time for enrichment, and extra time for teachers to collaborate. And this is a pretty big investment. It was on the order of a $20 million a year thing that the state was paying for. So we wanted to evaluate it and learn from it and improve it. And they had commissioned Apt to do a pretty elaborate impact evaluation and an implementation evaluation. So they were out interviewing teachers and students. They did surveys, even in comparison schools, not just schools that are participating in the program. They would do an impact study looking sort of like a difference in difference type model of kids in schools that got this relative to similar ones in the same district that didn't. Whole thing, 200-page annual report, like the standard thing you commission, right? And the thing is, this work, we spent so much time and effort on it, and it had virtually no impact. And the reason was that we never asked them to produce stuff when it would actually be timely. We asked them to do this once a year giant report. And so what would happen is they'd collect data all during the school year. They'd wait for the kids to take the MCAS, which is our state test, in the spring. Don't get the data back till the fall. Then the researchers need time to do the analysis. Then they've got to write the report. And it typically would be like January or February of the next school year that we found out what happened in the prior school year. And now, meanwhile, it's not like the program staff have no idea what's going on in the program. They are making changes to the program because they're realizing issues that have come up in implementation. They are dealing with, principles change. And so the researcher would have these recommendations. They'd be like, well, yeah, but all that stuff's not relevant anymore because that's all from last year. And this year's different because blah, 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 blah. And the thing that's so crazy about this is that we then hired Apt to do a different evaluation of, we were doing a big initiative in the state around how teachers, their performance gets evaluated. And so we wanted some implementation information about how our districts implementing this new change to policy, what early results we've seen. And this time, instead of having them do that annual report, we had them do like a just-in-time kind of strategy where, for example, they would do a fall survey of teachers, and then immediately we would get, within a few weeks, we would get a summary of the findings. And in fact, they would even, we would say, hey, we're doing a big event on November 6th for this. Could you run the analysis just for these 3 questions? Because the commissioner wants the data for the presentation. The rest of it can come later, but could you get those 3 solid for us? They would go do interviews. They produced reports in the end, not for us, not these giant 200-page things that nobody read, but reports actually for districts sharing the learning that we had gotten from all, because we realized the researchers were actually spending more time in the schools than we were. And so they were actually seeing things that they could share with, and that was the point, was to help practitioners do the work better. And the thing that is so nuts about this scenario is it's not even the same research firm. It is literally the same human beings, the same researchers on both projects. And we had just asked for the wrong deliverables. And if we had just asked for something different, they could have done it. It was not at all about the capacity issue. It's just we asked for the wrong thing. So the more general issue here, I think, about the deliverables and stuff is that you really do need to communicate effectively around what is your timeline, when do you need things, for what is the audience you're aiming for, and having just a longer, more detailed collaboration around that really helps a lot. I also think the sharing early findings, which makes researchers very uncomfortable because they like to send things out for review and kick the tires a bunch and make sure that it's right. And the thing is, you miss that opportunity to catch the weirdo result that the practitioner will look at and immediately be like, oh, well, that's because blah, 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 if you don't do those things early, but it requires some trust because the researchers are worried that you're going to go like make some giant change on the basis of a preliminary result that might not find, or you might trumpet it to the world. So you do have to build up some relationship in order to be able to do that. But it's one of these things that like, if you don't plan for it, it's not going to go well and you're going to be frustrated and you're not going to get the result you want out of it. So the fifth thing, the final thing, is we consistently undervalued the role of brokers in research work. And what I mean by a broker is someone who works kind of in between research and practice. Like actually my old job was kind of like this, where I was working with practitioners who were helping to generate questions, and I was working with researchers who were answering them. It doesn't have to be a role though. It's really more skills or activities, things you do to make the partnership work well together. And the role of the broker is to make sure those 4 other things I just listed don't happen, right? So the broker is there to make sure that the research staff are having a good, a useful conversation around what the research agenda should be. It's not just the researcher saying, please, whatever you want, you know? They're making sure that the right people are in the room for the conversation. They're making sure that you're planning ahead for how you're going to communicate the findings with that one sentence with a number in it. They're making sure that you've got the deliverables time. And by doing these types of activities, they strengthen the individual people participating in the partnership, and they also strengthen the partnership itself. They do things like creating governance structures or routines of meetings or ways of communicating, those kinds of things. They assess and improve the partnership, and they build the skills of the individual people around like actually how to use data or how to build relationships so that you can weather challenges when people leave or those sorts of things. And so not planning enough investment in that type of work can really cause problems in partnerships because it causes these ripple effects with everything else, right? You have to have somebody who's got their eye on that ball. So to help with that, I have been collaborating with some colleagues at the National Network for Education Research Practice Partnerships to try to describe what brokers do, what are the activities, and actually some specific strategies. So we have, I'm going to put in the chat, a handbook that we just put out a couple months ago that describes a framework for the activities brokers take on. And then the thing that I think is really awesome is there's little tools and vignettes in there about how to do them that are contributed by people actually doing the work. So if you are in a situation working with a researcher where you're really struggling with how to design the deliverables well, there are examples in there of how to do that. Or if you're stuck on a data sharing agreement or whatever, examples of how to do that, how to create, organize a conference where you're generating conversations across research and practice, that kind of stuff. So those are kind of my my mea culpas, the things I screwed up in my work doing research partnerships over the years. And I can imagine if I were in your shoes, I might be thinking like, oh my gosh, this sounds really hard. Why would I want to do this? This is not worth the effort. And let me tell you why I think it is worth the effort. Because I've seen the change it makes in organizations to do this kind of work well. And I'm going to tell you this story by telling you about actually the very first project that I worked on at the agency, which was literally on my first day of work. My boss came to me with like the list of things he'd saved up for the research director to do. One of which was to get a study going of the impact of charter schools in Boston relative to the traditional schools in Boston. And we had some researchers who wanted to work on it. We had some money, but trying to figure out like just how to get the data out the door, like how to design the study, that kind of thing. And at this point, so I'm starting with, first of all, a program office who they are very interested in this question. So they're excited to do the project, not a whole lot of experience working with researchers and not a whole lot of technical knowledge about research. And then I have a research team who is, if there's like a normal distribution of nerdiness, they are off the screen, like over here on the level of technical detail that they are at. So this is like, they are wildly far apart. And so there were a lot of meetings I went to with the program staff being like, let me explain why we're so excited about your lottery, trying to like why we're so excited that you randomly assign when you're over enrolled and that kind of thing. And at the same time, working with the researchers around, okay, I know you're jazzed up about the lottery, but that only works for the schools that have more applicants than spaces available. And lots of our schools don't have that. So we need a strategy to answer just generally, not just for the school. Anyway, so we started that point. And like, you know, we worked together. The first project went really well. It actually was another one that really changed policy. We ended up increasing our charter cap a few years later because the impact was so large from so large that it just, and the research method so definitive that it just changed the conversation about charters in the state. And so that project goes well. We do another. We kind of build up a relationship, get to know each other, work much more closely together, more proactive. We eventually, by 9 years later, get to a point where that research team comes to me and says, hey, we want to put on a day-long conference about research on charter schools, or not just charters, but like research in Massachusetts that we've put together. And so this is like their little ecosystem of researchers have enough work going on that they can fill an entire day. They say to me, but we don't want it to be a traditional research conference. We don't want it to be like a bunch of equations and then somebody else saying that you clustered your standard error wrong or whatever. So instead, we want practitioners to be the respondents and talk about, what does this mean for my work? How have I used this finding to actually do something different? And we've had it at the Federal Reserve Bank. We had a couple hundred people there, and it's a great conversation. We've got like the superintendent of schools from Boston. We have a bunch of other superintendents, people from local foundations, and all this stuff. And it was really a day where I felt like I can see the difference that this work made. And it's hard. This is the kind of work that is not super visible. It takes a long time to pay off, but I could see the difference in the nature of the questions my colleagues were asking and in the nature of the way the researchers were working with the practitioners over that 9 years that like I couldn't have predicted on day one. And I will add in closing that one of the researchers who we worked with literally won the Nobel Prize 2 weeks ago for, in part, this project, more so for the work he did before that enabled it, but it was pretty cool that he won a Nobel Prize in the end. So if you do research work well, your partner might win a Nobel Prize. That is my conclusion. So that's what I had prepared, Jacob. I'm happy to just go wherever you want to go at this point.
Yeah, that was so fantastic. I've gotten a lot of private chat messages from folks. My only response is just copy paste. Everything Carrie says is gold. So yes.
That is a lie. That is a total lie. But this
well,
one
I would
like learn the hard way, right? So
Carrie Conaway's greatest hits. I love it. I'll just open up the floor to the audience for questions. As Carrie said, you could ask questions about the research partnerships topic, or if you want to kind of take it in a different direction. She has a wealth of knowledge of all things ed policy and practice.
May I?
Yeah.
sure.
Hi. Thank you, Carrie. That was really amazing. As someone with a toe in both camps, I'm the district administrator and pursuing my PhD here at Tech. It's like really the whole research practice partnership is really resonates with me. I see the value, and especially after hearing you speak, I see it even more. I have a couple questions, if you don't mind. The first one is like goes right back to the first thing that you said, and you were talking about looking forward rather than backward. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit. You were talking about evaluating programs and how maybe sometimes the practitioner is going to ask you to evaluate things that already happened. But it seemed like you were more talking about developing sort of like future evaluations in concert with the practitioners. Can you speak more about that maybe?
Yeah. So my job at the agency was, my title changed like 5 times when I was there, but it always has the words research and planning in it. I think the reason those two things go together is that you need some like on-ramp, right, to do, and that whether it's an internal research project that you're just doing yourself or whether it's something you're working with an external researcher on, you need some time to like figure out the project. And so the looking backward is very hard because it's retrospective and you don't have time, in particular with external people, to build the relationships and knowledge that you need. And so the way we would do our planning process in the agency was we would, a whole bunch of things we did around like prioritizing what projects we were going to focus on for the year, several series of meetings and stuff. And then at the end, once they kind of figured out the rough plan, we would have a whole meeting about like, all right, what do we need to learn from this work in order to do it better over time? And so we would, my colleagues and I would sit and try to articulate what are the questions we have around the quality of implementation, the impact of what we're doing, and the forward looking, like where are we likely to be headed in the next few years? And then I always viewed my job as the research director as being like helping the practitioners articulate those questions and then figuring out how to bring the resources in or from within or external to get those questions answered, whether it was commissioning a researcher to do something, doing it internally, bringing an intern in. And so that's what I mean when I'm talking about that forward looking thing, is like creating a conversation around the work that helps push work forward and help people do things better over time. Does that clarify, Joe, or do you have a follow-up?
No, it clarifies very much. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I see a couple questions from Levi in the chat. Maybe let's see. The first one is what to do if 4 people deep if there aren't 4 people. Yes, that is a challenge. I mean, the facetious answer would be like, all right, as many people deep as you have, right? The small districts are tough. And we have a lot of them in Massachusetts. You think of it as being as a fairly urban district, but in fact, our average district is about 3,000 students, which is not large. That's like 3 elementary schools, a middle school, and a high school kind of size. So actually, I wrote my book, Common Sense Evidence, thinking of Ruth Gilbert Whitner, who is the superintendent from Whitman-Hanson schools, because she's a superintendent of a district about that size, and trying to think about like, what can I do to help her? I do think, for one thing, I think within a district that size, you can still have an orientation around learning from your work. It just means you might not do as fancy of a research project, but who cares? And I think in terms of connecting with people, the nice thing about those small districts is everybody knows each other, right? So it is, I think, actually easier to build those connections. They might be a little farther removed, like you're not going to have a whole team of people who do nothing but English language learner work or whatever, but you might be able to get the EL person and the chief academic officer and maybe the special ed person or something like that would help build relationships and sustain your work over time. So it takes shoe leather and effort. And I'm telling you right now, I did not do this well. It is hard. Let's see. So you also asked about managing. Oh yeah, so managing deliverables on multi-year projects. Yes, we absolutely built in plans to revisit, renegotiate. It's actually one of the things that's hard about commissioning research you pay for in state government, is that the procurement people want you to be very specific about the deliverables. And I actually didn't want to be very specific about the deliverables. So what you get good at is writing things that sound specific to procurement people, but in fact are not specific. So you write things like, we will have a planning meeting to decide on the deliverables. We will do, at least some minimal number of reports, or, something that like, you can attain and check those boxes from the procurement perspective, but then leaves you room to adjust as you learn from what you're doing and adjust over time.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Did you ever get burned by a vendor because you were too general on the setup that you know what I mean? Like in some projects, it's almost like we're trying to back people into a corner to make sure that we can hold them accountable on the back end. And maybe that's just a symptom of a lack of trust that needed to be addressed more foundationally.
Yeah, you can't fix through a contract. You can't fix a relationship through a contract. And I think that's the fundamental thing that procurement and attorney type people miss, is that like, you have to trust the person. It's the same thing with the data sharing agreements, right? Because like there's this whole elaborate process around sharing confidential student data with researchers to execute research projects. The amount of time and effort that goes into this, and attorneys wanting to specify to the nth degree, like, what if this and what if that and what if this, and like, in the end, you either trust the research partner to not act like a jerk or not. And so I remember actually on that charter school project, that very first one I described, sitting in a windowless room with the attorneys from Harvard, the attorneys from my office, and me, and like one of my research partners. And this is a guy, not Josh Angrist, who won the Nobel Prize, but one of the other researchers, is somebody I've known for years before I took this job. And finally, I looked at my attorney. I was like, I know Tom's not going to screw us over. Like, I am willing to sign this because I know it's going to be fine. But if you don't have that relationship, and that's the thing when you're bidding out, and especially in a public agency, you get who you get, right? So if it's a vendor you haven't worked with before, I can understand why people are a little more perspective. But I actually found more frequently I had the opposite problem. I had overspecified and I didn't leave them enough room for their expertise and their creativity. And I learned over the years to be more general and leave more room for the researchers to do their job, which is to scope the project appropriately given the resources. So.
Carrie, can I ask a question for Jen Freeman? She asks, how do you navigate or reconcile relationships with stakeholders if you find potentially negative findings about a particular program or intervention, or the findings just don't go the way that those kind of, calling the researchers want it to go or think it should go? Can you kind of talk about any experiences with stakeholders or folks, having a negative reaction to something like that, and repercussions including, restricting data or not wanting something published? Like how do researchers and, stakeholders navigate that situation?
Yeah, this definitely can happen. I thankfully didn't have too many challenges with this, but I certainly have a few stories which I'm happy to share. I think that this is one big reason. I think another good reason not to start with the does my program work or not question, because you are immediately starting actually a pretty high stakes question for the program person. They're immediately going to be defensive of any answer that is not yes, what's the word for that? Like an unvarnished yes, or like, and you haven't had much time to really learn about the work yet. And I mean, those of us who are more statistics oriented know that the default answer to this question is no. Like generally things don't work. So you're probably not going to find that the thing worked. And so this is why I think it's really important to start with something more descriptive and something more long run. So you're building knowledge and trust. I do think when this happens, this is another reason to share findings early, because it gives people time to plan their messaging around it if it's going to be sort of a public big thing. I would not pick, as I did, the single most politically sensitive topic one could choose, which is charter schools, as your very first project. I did not know this. I should start by saying I was new to the education field. It could have just as easily been any other topic as far as I was concerned. Charter schools, sure, we can figure out whether that works or not. Oh, great, they have a lottery. Sounds good. I had no idea. And I'm so lucky that we did not totally blow this up. I mean, it did really help actually that the findings were so positive. Like that, had it been a negative, that would have been a harder one. I do remember working that expanded learning time project that I described. So the state was running the program, but we had a third party. They were kind of like an advocate and a technical assistance support for so this is another organization external to us that's very invested in this program, right? And they really want to see it be positive because they're the ones who are out in front of the legislature, like trying to advocate for this money, which is not, the agency was less invested in it in that way. And so every time we got these findings, and by the way, the findings were basically, it's actually worse than no effect. It's we can't tell if it has an effect. The study was kind of on the underpowered side. The impacts would have had to have been enormous in order for us to precisely measure them. And this program also had huge variability in treatment effects, meaning like some schools did great stuff and did really amazing, got great outcomes for kids, others not so much. And so you've got a very noisy zero scenario. And so we would go to these meetings where we would share the findings and they'd always be so disappointed. And then they would want our data because they'd want to like run their own analysis their own way so that they could find their own answer that was the one they liked better. And the thing that was particularly exasperating about that was that we couldn't share the data with them. Like legally, we were not allowed to, but the commissioner would not remember that. And so I would have to have, and he would be like, well, Carrie, why can't we share the data? And then I'd have to have like 6 more meetings with the commissioner explaining why we can't give them the data. And it just was so tiresome. It was so tiresome. It helped over time that they just kind of knew that this was likely to happen and they stopped being so pestery about it. But it definitely caused a lot of uncomfortable conversations. And they didn't blow up the project or the evaluation, I think, because we had built good relationships, but it definitely could have if we had not. And I had to go to a lot of meetings about data sharing as a result, which was zero fun. So.
And then Annette asked a question in the chat. Would you include innovation in the pushing the work forward? How or does innovation fit in this work?
So Annette, are you saying that like if you're doing lots of, I might be reading more into this question than what you're saying. So please tell me. I'm wondering if what you're asking me is, if what you're doing is lots of iterative improvement work, how do you get the big new idea? Is that what you mean?
How you have both and it not be perceived as the same, or is it the same? So we've recently brought in the innovation department into research accountability, into the same department that research and accountability lies. And so now we're trying to distinguish. We know we're not duplicating efforts, but I don't mean this in a negative way, but those that are not familiar with the work, you know, how do you explain that? Or is it the same work? I know it's not the exact same work, but anyway, that's just a struggle right now that I'm dealing with, because we recently had this merging of departments.
And are you in one of those departments, or are you in yet another department?
Yes, I am research and accountability.
Okay, and then you've got these innovation people.
Yes, but then school choice, which is supposed to be new and innovative schools that we're trying to develop, also falls in our department. So just kind of bringing it all together, but really helping people understand it's not more of the same or changing what we currently have in place. It's we're looking for new ways to do things. And that's where the pushing the work forward like came to mind is, yes, we want to push the work forward, but it could be just doing away with that altogether and implementing something brand new. But I know I just went on about a lot of things. Sorry.
Oh, no, not at all. And are you in a district, it sounds like?
I am, yes.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, we did not have an innovation department at my agency. I guess we thought it was everyone's job and not the innovation team's job. So yeah, it sort of feels like, this is not the question you asked me. I kind of feel like by calling it the innovation department, you've doomed it to failure, because how is it ever going to be like, no one's ever going to believe it's innovative. Like it is, I don't know. That feels like a weird way to think about the world, but you know, I've seen them in other places. I mean, if it were me, I mean,
so I've been informed that the innovation department establishes their own research questions and they're just out there doing their own thing, which ties in if we don't bring in the practitioners, they're just going to see it as one more thing that they really don't have a clue about, right? So that's been my point, trying to bring it all together is, yeah, you can think of all these wonderful things to do, but if we don't bring in the people within the district, the practitioners, in on the conversation, it's really hard to move that work forward. But anyway.
Yeah, I totally, I mean, it feels like that's in a way, actually, what it reminds me of is when I worked at the agency towards the end, they put all the federal grants under me, because the idea was that they wanted the federal grants to reflect evidence-based practice and to do a better job of evaluating those programs and that kind of thing. But so then we had to have we really had to spend a lot of time figuring out what is it we have in common? Where are the connections between the two sides of the grant part of the work and the research team's work? And my experience over time was that there actually was more connection there than it might have seemed obvious at first. And so there's something about just learning the work that's better, but it does also feel like, I mean, I hope your innovation team is evaluating their programs and not just innovating, and if not, then maybe that's a connection point that the research team can help them with that side of it or something.
Ignore my comments, Dr. Kirksey, okay? Pretend you're not here.
It's a safe space. But yeah, that, I mean, yeah, that reorgs in general, I think, are hard because like you often end up putting together teams that sort of sound like they should go together and then in fact don't, or vice versa, you know?
Well, I think that
And-
was intentional because of what you just asked.
Right.
Evaluating those things that are, just those innovative, wonderful things. But no, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. It's actually one of the reasons I went to my current job at Harvard. One of my big roles is I'm teaching a course that starting next year will be required for all our master's students on evidence use. And it was because I personally think that one of the best tools we have available to us to improve education outcomes for kids is to learn from our work and improve it over time. We are so good at planning our work and not so good at planning our learning. And that sounds like what I'm hearing you say about the innovation team, that if we don't start to plan our learning, we have no way to know whether we've done anything well or whether we need to improve things or not. I would rather bet on a district that had maybe a mediocre strategic plan, but a good plan around its learning, than a district who had well planned its activities, but had no strategy around learning from its work. So, Mike, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. The reason I liked your line about people arguing about the standard error. That was funny. I guess what I was going to say is, I've been a high school teacher before. Some large staffs pushing 200 on the faculty, and if I walked in with one of Kirksey's articles, I don't think people are going to jump on and go, "Yeah, let's argue about this." When you talk about participants, what do you exactly mean? I mean, Joe Sixpack teaching math in 7th grade. I don't know. I mean,
Oh, at that particular conference, you mean?
well,
or
just
just
in general. In things I read about policy is it's hard to get people to implement it. And so I'm fascinated that who are these participants that you're talking to, these researchers, because most of the time teachers I know, education research is something they have zero interest in.
All right. Well, again, why I am teaching this master's level class at the end school is to change that. But what I mean, so first of all, I was at a state agency, so we actually didn't have teachers. We had people who are working in policy. I actually think that's research and policy, I think, work a little better together, because in a policy environment, you don't have kids in front of you. Your kids come in data form. So research is the way you learn from kids. Whereas I think in a school setting, something more like an improvement science approach, where it's more like in your classroom, iteratively changing and improving designs, but it's not something at scale in the same way that like big R research would be, I think builds the same muscle in a different way. It was interesting to see over the decade that I worked at the agency, the practitioners that we hired in the program roles, increasingly, I thought, the ones who were more proficient at working with data and research were the ones who were more successful in terms of getting like leadership opportunities, chances to run programs, things like that. So over time, we built a relatively more proficient group of people, but I agree with you, Mike, that like it is not typical of the education field. And many of my colleagues didn't have particularly strong research skills. I view that as part of my role. And it's actually, I've come to realize now that I'm teaching a class that like the hard thing about that is that I don't have the structure of a class to teach where I've got a planned set of lessons. The pro is it's totally embedded in their work. And so they're way more engaged and interested in learning. Like my charter school office folks could now very clearly explain to you the value of a lottery design relative to a more traditional statistical approach for that, because it was helping them answer a question they cared about. So that may have gone off on a tangent a bit, but I'm hopefully that was helpful. I think I missed a question from Joe in the chat earlier, I'm noticing. So you're actually two things. You're wondering how to get started with a research practice partnership and how to effectively communicate and disseminate. So getting started with RPPs, I think there's a few ways you can go about it. One is just to like build relationships with people. I know researchers don't like interacting with humans, I'm sorry. So, but it turns out that's actually a good chunk of the work, right? And Joe, you're in a district, right? So you have relationships with people. This should be easy for you.
Yeah, that part's less intimidating for me, for sure.
Right, exactly. I mean, if not, I often think like I don't think we take sufficient advantage of going where the practitioners actually are. Like, I go every year to the Massachusetts School Superintendents Association conference, because that's where I hear what are the challenges that they're struggling with, what do they need help with, what questions do they have. So I would look for opportunities like that. Or like public events. Like, I know I could tell you in Massachusetts, list off like the Rennie Center, the Wheelock Policy Center, you know, where practitioners come and it's not just researchers. So start to, you know, do a little networky thing. Once in a while, people actually post like procurements and you could actually bid on those, but that's sort of like, that's a whole headache. And I do think starting small is good generally. It really sort of annoys me when people state that they are going to go create a research practice partnership, because to me that is in the doing. Like, it's, first of all, it's by definition long-term, right? So it can't be long-term if it hasn't started yet. And it is about the relationship between people in a way that, like, I just don't think you can operate in a way that is consistent with a partnership, but I don't think you can just decree one into existence, you know? Regarding communicating and disseminating research to practitioners. So I never had to worry about this at the agency because I was answering the questions my colleagues actually had, right? So they were like waiting for me. They're like, where's those findings from that survey we did? I want to know what we learned or whatever. I think, but that's for a more instrumental way of thinking about research use, right? So like they've asked a specific question, they're waiting for the answer, or they maybe another version of that might be, we're thinking about changing something in this policy. Let's go look at what the previous research suggests about thus and so. But more often, what I think practitioners are doing is conceptual use of research. So it's more influencing what they define as a question, or the framework in which they are thinking about the issue, or the way of organizing the work, something like that, or they're designing something. They're not just like looking to pull off a shelf and go implement something. They want to get ideas and then design something that works for their context. And so that takes a different kind of communication strategy. There, I think you're talking more things like op-ed pieces, or getting stuff out into Ed Week or Ed Next, or places like that that practitioners are reading to influence it, or books. There was a national, what?
Podcasts.
Oh yeah, podcasts. There's a national study like 3 years ago or 4 years ago that asked people in school and district leadership roles, tell us about a piece of research that influenced you, and just like literally tell us, give us the name of it so we can go find it. And by far the most common thing people cited was books. Like 3 to 1 to the next closest. Now, who would think, like, people are always like, practitioners don't read, everything has to be short. But the thing is that books provide a framework and a way of thinking about an issue that you can't develop in an 800-word op-ed. And so like Tony Brake's, what is that book? The book about Chicago that he did. Like, that was like that kind of book is what people were citing. So, you know, it takes a while to get to the point in your career that you can produce a book like that, but like even just things that get ideas out in the sphere, like you're not going to see the impact in the way that you would if you like did the survey for the team and then they acted on the survey. But I don't want to discount that broader influence, because I think in the end, that's what changes things. Let's see. Levi's asking, what are RPP brokers? Where do you get them? What are they? So can you build them, or do they just have to be born into being? Well, so, you know, when I started working at the agency, I didn't actually know that was what my work was. Like, I didn't think of myself as doing a thing called brokering. I thought of it as like, I'm trying to get this research project to work, and I'm trying to have it matter. And like, it seems like it'd be good if like we talk to each other and stuff like that. So I'm excited that we now have this framework to sort of articulate what it is that people are doing. I mean, some people are more naturally better at this than others. Like, and I do think there is absolutely a role in a research partnership for people who do nothing but the research, right? They're in the numbers, they love that stuff, or maybe it's qualitative, it doesn't have to be quant, but like, you know, they're in the work and they maybe aren't the best at this sort of in-between role. And similarly, the practitioners who are like, my passion, my heart is in running this program for kids. And like, I care about the answer, but I don't want to be in this in-between space. I actually would put Josh Angers, the Nobel Prize winner, very much in that researcher only category. He appreciates that other people do brokering work, but it is not his core competency, you know, but somebody has to do it. That's the thing. It doesn't have to be a single person. It could be that everyone involved is doing a little bit of the work around making sure. It doesn't have to be on the research side or the practice side. It could be either, but somebody has to be paying attention to those relationship issues. But I do think quite a lot of people are actually better at this than I think they are. Like, it's, especially once you know that it needs to happen, right? Like, it's sort of, your attention is raised to, like, and you don't make all the mistakes the hard way, the way that I did. You know what to do. And so you make sure, like, okay, I'm working on this research project. I need to make sure we have regular meetings with the team. You know, somebody's got to organize that. We want to have a conference. What would that look like? You know, so I think people can get better at this. And I hope that that's what the handbook will help with, is making that easier to get better at it. We're also doing some coaching, by the way, related to the book, so, or the handbook. So we're hopefully going to learn from some people who are relatively new in roles where this is a big function of them, of theirs, brokering work, to learn more about, like, what it takes to actually do that work well. So ask me back next year and I'll tell you more.
So one quick follow-up to that. Do you have any thoughts on how to effectively advocate for resourcing those kinds of duties as you're developing these partnerships? Because oftentimes there's not a clean place in the, like, grant budget or the whatever. And so you end up with not having a way to be like, we need someone that is what they do, and that's really kind of all that they're doing, rather than just asking them, hey, you're doing whatever it is you're doing, and also we need you to set the agendas and all of these kinds of things, which sets them up for failure, right?
Yeah, it can, if they're too overloaded. I mean, this is the reason why the research office was created at the agency, because the people who did data stuff were just so busy with doing data reporting that they didn't have time to do this relationship building stuff. It wasn't that they couldn't do it. So I hear what you're saying about the need. I mean, if you're applying for grants that are specifically for research practice partnerships, they will get this, right? And they generally will have room and expect, and in fact, you won't do well in the competition if you don't plan for this work, right? It's the regular, more normal research grants are a little harder. So it might require looking for someone who, to the grantor, looks credible as the research person, but also happens to be the kind of person who's good at this. Or sometimes if it's a large enough grant, you can sometimes fund a position on either the research or the policy side. My experience is it tends to sell better on the policy side when you're applying to a research organization. Be like, we want to make sure we've got a person in the thing that's committed to this work and does it. I mean, again, that's a larger grant, but if you have one of those, that's a way to fund that. Or like the National Network of Education Research Practice Partnerships is pretty open about what they consider a partnership. And so that's a resource where you can post positions, find people, like learn about how to do the work, that you could maybe train up somebody who's already there and kind of has some skill and interest, but not a lot of experience. So, I mean, you would know better than I would the specific situations, but I've seen that work in a few different ways. So, but if you don't do it, you're going to fail, I will tell you. So like, you definitely have, somebody's got to do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, Carrie, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time. And thank you everyone for your great questions and engagement throughout. I just want to take a quick reminder that we have our third brown bag of the series coming up on November 16th from 12 to 1. Professor David Baker is going to give his talk on the globalization of universities and science. So thanks again, Carrie, and hopefully, Carrie's really open. So if you want to reach out, Carrie's email is on her website, and she also may be actively putting it in the chat. I can't tell. But thank you, Carrie, and I will see all of you next time. And this recording will go on our YouTube channel, so feel free to reference it. I already heard some people saying this was going to be required content for some of their courses, so this is great. Thanks, Carrie, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me.